Here on 2, we look forward to a spectacular railway pageant this weekend as Brian Redhead takes us behind the scenes for the preparations being made for a unique event, Rocket 150.
The opening this afternoon of Rocket 150, the great railway cavalcade. But this is not Rocket, this is Lion. So where, you ask, is Rocket? The answer, struggling. 3 times the replica came off the track before it could get here to Rainhill. So the afternoon has begun without it, and Rocket must try again tomorrow and Monday. Meanwhile, Lion, the oldest original locomotive in the world, has stolen its thunder. The official party had intended to arrive in a train drawn by Rocket, sitting in replica coaches of 1830. But instead they came in a train drawn by one of the great late Victorian locomotives, Hardwick. And they sat in sumptuous coaches, carriages which not so long ago belonged to the royal train. Sir Peter Parker, the chairman of British Rail, headed the official party with his wife, followed by Norman Fowler, the Minister of Transport, here to perform the opening ceremony with his wife, and then all the other guests alighted, and everyone was agog.
Chairman, I'm delighted to be associated with the celebrations today and to be able to declare open this 150th anniversary of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway. When the cavalcade comes past, government ministers and MPs are advised very much to keep off the track on this occasion.
A reference to the death of poor William Huskisson in 1830.
But Sir Peter, I would like now to open this cavalcade in the traditional way that I gather railways have always been opened, and that's with a bell which has got a history which I think the commentator will tell you about at a short space of time. But with this bell, I will now open this cavalcade.
The practice of opening a railway with a bell is in fact a Scottish custom, but it so happens that the present general manager of London Midland region used to work in Scotland, and when he left they gave him that bell as a present. And to be fair, we also have the band of the Irish Guards. Well, with the official ceremony over, the crowd settled down to enjoy the great cavalcade, even in spite of the absence of Rocket. Now, I want to show you the great cavalcade on Monday, and Rocket too, I hope, because, you see, all is not over for Rocket, nor indeed was this official opening the start. We have to go back along the track to the colliery siding, where this great railway cavalcade was assembled, and everybody did a great deal of work. Rocket 150 is a cavalcade to celebrate 2 great events in railway history: the Rainhill trials of 1829 and the opening of the Liverpool-Manchester Railway in 1830. And the purpose of the trials was to find the locomotive engine best suited to pull the trains on the new Liverpool-Manchester Railway, and so provide what we would now call the first regular passenger intercity rail service in the world. Now, the trials was a competition. The prize was £500, which wasn't a fortune even in those days. But whoever won knew that he stood to get the contract for all the locomotives for the railway. And of course, the locomotive that won is the most famous locomotive in the world, Robert Stevenson's Rocket. And this is it, or rather, this is a replica of it. But you must not imagine that this means that this was easily produced out of a mould. This was very difficult to construct, and judging by the feverish activity on it today, is still as capricious and as very much a one-off creation as the original Rocket. Now, there are those who wish that Rocket had never won those trials, but I believe that it was right that it did, because Rocket was the locomotive which was able to be developed most rapidly and most extensively. And indeed, it provided really the foundation of steam locomotives for the next 100 years. But of course, it had rivals. To be precise, two rivals, only one of which seriously worried the Stevensons, Robert and George, and that was this locomotive, Sans Pareil, and this too, incidentally, is a replica and very beautiful. Now, this locomotive had been built by a man called Timothy Hackworth, and Hackworth had worked for the Stevensons as an engineer and then got a job as locomotive superintendent on the Stockton and Darlington Railway. So he had a full-time job, he had 8 kids to feed and educate, but he still found time during the evenings to put together this magnificent locomotive. The trouble was he had to subcontract bits of work, he had to put things out to have them made for him, some of it to the Stevensons. And of course, when he failed in the trial, there were those afterwards who said there'd been a bit of sabotage. I don't believe a word of that myself. I think that in the end, he produced a locomotive which was slightly too heavy for the job, which proved to have all sorts of problems, and which indeed, had it won, would have pointed the whole development of locomotives in the wrong direction, because really, this was the last of its kind, whereas the Rocket was the first of its kind. Still, there was a third contender who was never really in with a chance. The T-urn was the name that they gave it in the Stevenson camp, and you can see why, but its real name was Novelty. It had been built by 2 blokes in London called Braithwaite and Ericsson. Had only heard about the Rainhill trials a few weeks before, and in fact they only had 7 weeks in which to make it. They had no experience of railways. They were used to building road engines, little things like fire engines. But they built it and they brought it to Rainhill, and the public loved it. The public thought it was very pretty, and this is the one that they wanted to win, because I really think they thought of the Stevensons as the big bad wolves. However, Novelty wasn't up to the job. Perhaps it was too underpowered. It certainly wasn't by any means reliable enough. And I'm sad to report that this replica too has its problems. It too is underpowered and lightly sprung, and has even toppled off the track. And I fear that it may need a lift to Rainhill. But whether they get to Rainhill under their own steam, or whether they require assistance, the 3 replicas, Novelty, Sans Pareil and Rocket, will only be the beginning of a great cavalcade of trains. A cavalcade now being assembled here at Bold Colliery, and which represents the whole history of British railways from the very beginning right through into the future, because even the APT is here, not yet in service, and sadly it too will need assistance to get to Rainhill because it's electric and the line here is not electrified. But all the work is being done on the great steam locomotives, all being spruced up, decorated, getting up ahead of steam and being photographed endlessly. I'd like to show you 1 or 2 of the ones you'll remember most. Do you remember Princess Elizabeth? One of the great interwar express trains, long before we'd heard of intercity travel. And Sir Nigel Gresley, named, of course, after its designer, Sir Nigel Gresley, the famous designer of East Coast trains, who also designed Mallard, very much the same kind of locomotive, which holds the world steam record. Gresley's great rival was Sir William Stanier, who designed the trains that went up the West Coast. And much, much older, Hardwick, one of the great steam locomotives of the end of the last century, which took part in the races right up to the north, when they used to race to see who could get first to Aberdeen. But I think the one that has attracted most attention today is the little working engine Robert. It works here at Bold Colliery every day of its life, and it looks as if it stepped straight off the pages of a children's book. A big steam locomotive, something like a Flying Scotsman, costs a great deal of money to operate and to maintain. And in any case, if you own one, what do you do with it? Well, George Hinchcliffe is chairman of SLOA, to be faster, the Steam Locomotive Operators Association. Do you regard this as a museum piece, or as a circus animal, or as what?
No, I regard it as a piece of plant, to do a piece of work to convey people from point A to point B and give them a very great deal of pleasure in doing so.
But it's more entertainment than transport.
Oh, of course, yes.
Are you allowed to run it on ordinary lines, or are you in danger of getting in the way of British Railways in their everyday operations?
We're allowed to run it on British Railways tracks, but we are confined to the secondary routes. We can't compete with the intercity trains, for instance, because we're limited to 60 miles an hour.
So if you have Flying Scotsman or any other big locomotive, what do you do with it, I mean, to earn enough money?
It pays its own way so far as operating is concerned. We have supporters organisations, quite a large number of volunteers. We do filming work. We put it on public display whenever possible. And the whole lot put together normally makes a little bit of profit at the end of the year.
But even if you've got the income, do the skills exist to keep the thing running?
Yes, they do, because skills are handed down from person to person. And the older hands, who are now slowly, and in some cases rapidly, disappearing from British Rail, are passing their skills on to the younger ones. And so we've really got younger people of the age of perhaps 20, 25, who are learning skills which died out 10 and 15 years ago.
And when you say young people, these are not just enthusiasts. I mean, there is a career, is there still, in steam locomotion?
Very much so, because as you were saying earlier, we're in entertainment business, and the various preserved railways and museum centres are now recruiting people who are making it their lifelong career of keeping these engines in working order.
Because there are those who would hope that steam locomotion might yet come back as a real business in the sense of an everyday one. Clearly it won't. Do you think as the days grow further apart, it'll become more and more attractive as an entertainment?
Oh, I'm sure it will, yes.
I mean, what do the children think of it, for instance, who come and see it?
Well, most of them think it's marvellous. The younger ones have seen the pictures of these marvellous machines in picture books and so on, and then they come and see them in the flesh. But occasionally one gets some marvellous remarks from children, like the little girl who said, "Oh, isn't it wonderful, Mummy, but what does it do?"
And did you explain to her what it did?
I tried to do my best to explain to her.
And they see it like a circus, do they not? So in a sense, in the end, the circus animal is perhaps the best description of it.
I think so. It's the best way of explaining it to someone who doesn't really understand the ins and outs.
George Hincliffe, thank you very much. So, some of the steam locomotives being prepared here for the cavalcade are privately owned, but many have come from the National Railway Museum at York. Among them, this one, Evening Star, the last steam locomotive to be made for British Rail. It was built at Swindon in 1960, and it ran for only 5 years and has been preserved for 15 years. So already it's had 3 times its life as a relic. And on the footplate is the Chief Mechanical Engineer of the National Railway Museum, John Bellwood, with a lovely fire. I imagine that this one is much easier to maintain, of course. It's practically new than the old Victorian ones.
Yes, they didn't take into consideration that the locomotive should look elegant, as was a major consideration with the Victorian locomotive engineers. In this case, it was ease of maintenance was of paramount importance, and the items requiring major attention were made as accessible as possible.
Practically put them on the outside where the Victorians covered them like piano legs.
Oh yes, they were felt to be indecent in Victorian parts were the mechanisms of the
When you're
locomotive.
maintaining the very old ones, so what's the most difficult thing? I mean, the mechanical thing, or making it match, getting paint back, you know, making it look as it looked in its early days?
It's a combination. One of the major problems is when we maintain an old locomotive in running condition, because we have to compromise to meet present-day safety regulations and requirements, which are much more stringent than they were 50 or 100 years ago.
So even at the museum at York, all the time you're thinking of getting them out and using them?
Yes, not every one of them, but the idea is to always have a representative selection of locomotives, usually unique ones. We don't like to duplicate locomotives of types that, say, the private preservation movement are running on their lines. But we have, of course, many unique locomotives in the national collection, and those are the ones which we concentrate on.
Well, I've always wanted to know how you drive one, and now seems to be the opportunity. Is the steam up, if that's the right expression?
Yes, the pressure gauge there shows that we've got about 100 pounds of steam, which is enough just to move the locomotive on its own. But when we would be working a train, we'd like in excess of 200 pounds per square inch pressure.
Good. So what do we do?
Well, there are 3 major controls. There's the regulator here, and this controls the flow of steam from the boiler into the cylinders to move the pistons to turn the wheels.
Yes.
There's the reversing gear here, which determines whether the locomotive goes forward or backwards, but also allows you to use the steam expansively. And that means that it can be used much more economically, use much less coal, much less water, which gives a longer range of operation of the locomotive. And then, of course, the paramount importance, having started the thing, you've got to stop it, so you've got the brake. The locomotive itself has got a steam brake, which is operated by this, but also to enable it to work vacuum-braked vehicles, that's carriages or wagons, it has a vacuum brake. And when it's on one of those trains, by operating the vacuum brake handle here, you proportionally apply the steam brake on the locomotive.
Do you think George Stevenson would have understood all that?
Oh, I think so. I mean, I think George Stevenson was pioneering so much that this would be child's play to him, was he living today.
And is it true that the firemen used to cook their breakfast on a shovel?
Yes, I'm told it is. I've never actually seen it done, but I'm assured by many driver friends of mine that it was a regular feature.
You know, I think I'll have a go at that, but John, thank you very much indeed. Apparently, to make his breakfast, the fireman used to clean his shovel with a slacker pipe, which sort of wastes steam. That made it hot, melted his fat on that, and then popped on his bacon and eggs and his sausage. Then all he had to do, you see, was open the fire door, stick it in and cook it. And on a good roaring fire, I mean, it was in and out in seconds, and no doubt straight down his mouth. I'm not sure that I'll eat it, though. I don't really think I fancy the taste of coal dust. It's going beautifully. Anyway, it's high time we moved away from firemen and locomotives to what they pulled, to the rolling stock. And I have with me another member of the National Railway Museum, the education officer, David Jenkins.
Well, I'm now standing inside the kitchen of one of the oldest preserved dining cars in Britain. It was built in the year 1900 by the London and North Western Railway, right at the height of the late Victorian, early Edwardian era of railways. It's not a very big kitchen, but it could cook a prodigious amount of food. Behind me here is a 12-ring stove, so you could have at least a dozen or more pans going strongly on here. And to my right here, there are two huge ovens, each of which could hold at least a 30-pound turkey. This was because this kitchen had to supply food for probably 50 people at a sitting and 2 sittings at a time. And when the food was cooked, it was brought to the door of the kitchen, handed to the waiter, who then had to negotiate his way along a rather narrow corridor, which we're now going down. There was a butler's pantry on the right, and then, of course, he would come out into the main dining saloon, which is a good deal more elegant place than the kitchen itself. And when you sat down, there was a prodigious amount of room, for this was the elegance of a first-class dining carriage of 80 years ago, one simply surrounded by the opulence of the period. Beautiful moquette, upholstery, plenty of room to shuffle around if you're a little on the portly side, as I am. Gorgeous inlaid mosaic and marquetry work in the woodwork. And even the tableware is worth a second look. How about this for a coffee pot, for instance, after you'd had your meal? Even the crockery itself is gold-banded and marked with the actual device of the railway on which it ran. This one is, in fact, the London and North Western Railway. And, of course, the Liverpool and Manchester itself became part of the London and North Western Railway. Upon my right, we have wine bottle holders. Not just ordinary bits of metal or anything like that, but even these too are inlaid with woodwork. In fact, this dining car was so good that when it was built in 1900, before it was put into service, the railway sent it to Paris on exhibition, where it won a Grand Prix. And it wasn't long after it came back to Britain that it was given a very different utilisation altogether. In fact, it was taken out of regular service and put to use in the British Royal train. And if we move along to the other part of the vehicle, we can see exactly the alterations that were made. Well, originally, this saloon, like the one next door, was arranged with fixed seating, but as you can see, it's very different now. The reason is that in 1901, when King Edward VII came to the throne, the railways built him a new royal train. Now, his mother, Queen Victoria, didn't like eating on the railway trains at all, but King Edward was a very different monarch to Queen Victoria, and it wasn't long before he wanted dining facilities on his royal train. And so, at a date which is not totally certain, this vehicle was altered from the arrangement we've seen to this open saloon with its individual dining chairs. Nothing much was changed in terms of decor, except for the insertion of new woodwork where the fixed seating was removed, and the new chairs were made specially for the occasion. The table could be arranged for any number of people from 2 or 3 up to 8, and we've got it laid out for 6, with the places staggered so that the customers had a little bit more room to partake of their meal. Well, when we sit down at this particular table, we discover that the silverware is much as we'd expect. But the crockery is a bit different, because it's a special blue-banded variety that was only used on the Royal trains, and as far as I know, this particular pattern is still in use on the current Royal train service. Now, as I said, the number of people could dine in this vehicle varied from 3 or 4 to 8, but we've been told that when the Queen was travelling, and this vehicle was used by the present Queen as recently as 1956, she always occupied the chair diagonally opposite on my left. And the vehicle itself didn't come into the museum collection until not much more than 20 years ago, so it's had a long and honourable life. For many years it was retired and just on public view, but last year we took the opportunity to thoroughly overhaul it and put it into full running order again, and as recently as last September, this old dining car, 79 years old, helped to commemorate the centenary of railway catering by travelling 2,500 miles round Britain with people sitting at these very seats eating meals. In the early days of mechanised railway travel, the railways were anxious to woo their customers from the patrons of the old road carriages or stagecoaches. And it's not really too surprising that their very earliest attempts at building a passenger railway carriage should follow the stagecoach idiom. They even painted them in the same colours and gave them some of the names of the old stagecoaches. This one's called Traveller. One particular difference that's worth noting, though, is that instead of just one section of enclosed area with 2 facing seats and a door, the railways realised they could pull rather heavier loads because they'd got smoother wheels and smoother rails. So they grafted 3 sections together. We call them compartments in our present day and age. And they put the 3 sets of carriage bodies onto 1 set of wheels and then attached them to each other to make a train as long or as short as they wanted. But there was another problem too. In the days of the stagecoach, if you couldn't afford to ride inside in something like this, then you rode on the roof of the stagecoach, or you walked. Well, it was highly dangerous to allow passengers to ride on the roof of a stagecoach. So if you couldn't afford to get inside one, you had to ride on something rather more primitive. And the Liverpool and Manchester Railway was no exception in this either, because these were first-class carriages for the more expensive customers, but beyond me, down at the end of the line, were the second and third-class carriages. Nothing much more than open boxes in which you stood up to have your journey. You got wet, but you didn't get quite as wet for quite as long as if you'd been riding on the stagecoach. And occasionally the railway might even drill a few holes in the floor to let the rain out.
The oldest locomotive in the cavalcade is Lion. Now, you might recognise it as the Titfield Thunderbolt. And when I say oldest, I mean because it's the real thing. It's not a replica. This one was actually built in 1838 for the Liverpool-Manchester Railway. But, of course, it has to be driven. Driven in the cavalcade like all the other locomotives and driven by regular crew of British Rail. And I have with me the fireman and the driver who are going to do it. Tony Taylor's the fireman, Albert Ramsdale is the driver. I bet you didn't learn on something like this.
No, we actually started on steam engines. In the early days of 1935, I started on the railway.
Now, is this simpler to drive than the ones you learned on, or more difficult, or...?
It's simpler for the simple reason there's less controls, and it's easier.
So you started and you stop it and you can't do much else?
Well, that's it, yes. And
Now,
only backwards and forwards.
Yeah. Now, when you're firing it, I mean, is it more sensitive than firing a more recent steam train?
Well, steam's easily gained, and it's also easily lost.
Do you have troubles with it?
You haven't much to play with. There's only 50 pounds boiler pressure.
So you're a bit,
much to play with.
I mean, that's a strange comparison, but a bit like a helicopter pilot. I mean, you have your eyes on the gauge all the time.
Well, quite a bit of it, yes.
Do you get any sense of excitement when you drive it, or...?
Yes, there's that extra thrill of being concerned with it, you know, really, and I like to pay tribute to the people that built it in the first place, and the people it is...
Well, it had a long spell, didn't it, this
Yes.
one, in the Mersey docks and harbour as a sort of static engine, but now it's back in use. Can we just have a look and see how you do use it? I mean, what are the simple controls?
This is the regulator, this is the steam supply.
Yeah.
And this is the reverser, which is the forward and backwards.
And you just hang your head around the side to see where you're going?
Just to place it like that and put it in gear for forward and that way for backwards.
I don't know whether you talk about consumption per hundredweight or what, but how much fuel does it consume?
It doesn't consume a lot.
No?
No, but I wouldn't like to say how much per mile, but it doesn't consume a lot. No.
And how, in the end, how fast do you think you can get it?
Oh, we've had it 25 mile an hour on the speed test.
Have you?
For braking power, yes.
Well, thank you both very much indeed. I'm sure this is one people are really going to love in the cavalcade.
Oh, yes, yes.
If the great cavalcade requires British Rail crews, no less does it require British Rail management. And David Ward is passenger marketing manager of London Midland Region. Now, I can see it's going to be a great weekend, but why did British Rail decide to do it?
Well, firstly, we need to pay tribute to the past. This is, in fact, the start of railways. The opening of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway was the first intercity line, and I think most historians would accept that it was really the first milestone in the railway network as we know it today.
So in that sense, of course, Rainhill chose itself as the location to do it all, but had it any difficulties logistically?
Yes, it chose itself historically, but by great good fortune, it also chose itself logistically. We have the coal board power station and the power station here, and they very kindly opened their sidings and made us very hospitable with all our rolling stock and
in other words, if you hadn't had this colliery as an assembly point, it would have been very difficult to mount it.
It would, very difficult indeed. The other thing is that the actual Rainhill level, where Rocket won its £500 in 1829, also lent itself commercially because there can be very little free viewing.
Oh, you've got to pay to get in unless you watch it on the box.
That's right.
But you must have spent a lot of money on it nonetheless.
Very nearly £1 million. And we are hoping to make a profit on it, and that is another reason why, in fact, we are doing it. The second reason is that we really want to be able to show off all our modern rolling stock. We shall have in the cavalcade a modern freight locomotive and a modern electric locomotive, and of course we shall conclude it with the advanced passenger train, which takes us into the next 150 years.
So what do you hope the weekend will achieve, apart from entertaining a great bank holiday crowd?
Firstly, I think it will pay tribute to a tremendous past. Secondly, I think it's a very good thing to do from the point of view of staff morale, because it does provide a variety in life. And thirdly, I think it will show to the public generally what a great future the railways have got and what some of the great rolling stock which we are now putting onto our modern trains.
So in other words, the whole thing is a marvellous publicity enterprise for British Rail.
That's correct, yes.
Good, excellent. Well now, as I see, it's about to be mounted. It's called Rocket 150. 3 days. Today, tomorrow and Monday, the public will see this great cavalcade. And on Monday afternoon at 10 to 5, in an hour-long programme, we'll show you the whole cavalcade. It's a programme that no railway lover can afford to miss. I hope you'll watch. Meanwhile, let you and I go and play trains.